Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me for the Wednesday edition of Point of View. For those of you in the Dallas area, did you see the Blue Angels? They flew almost right over the building where we broadcast from, so that was pretty interesting. Started in Allen or McKinney area and then flew all the way down through Dallas, just as a way to encourage those individuals that we certainly want to encourage as well, those first responders and those individuals that are on the front lines as we deal with this coronavirus. So if nothing else, I think some of us got a chance to see the Blue Angels. If not, I'm sure the local media will cover it later as well. While we're talking about local, before we get into some other issues, of course, yesterday was a surprise for most of us. We were aware of the fact that the owner of the Dallas salon, Shelley Luther, would probably be penalized in some way. Perhaps they would lock the doors of the salon. Maybe they would take her license away. I don't think most of us were ready for her to actually have to spend 7 days in jail. Actually, it's a 14-day, but it's serving concurrently. So 7 days in jail and a $7,000 fine. And so, again, we were seeing this as something that is not only kind of a local story, it has become a national story. I noticed the Drudge Report has covered it, and Rush Limbaugh mentioned it a while ago. And so, if nothing else, it illustrates that there are some that want to make an example out of those individuals who defy these orders. But it also illustrates a point that I was going to make earlier when she first started doing this. If you get a number of other people to do it with you and you exercise civil disobedience, there aren't enough police officers, there aren't enough courts to deal with this, which brings me to one of these pieces by Dominic Green. The lockdown is over. Somebody tell the government. And what he says is the coronavirus shutdown is over by public demand. There are crowds of sunbathers in the parks of New York City. Mobs on the steps of state houses, pedestrian and road traffic rising. Businesses are defying orders by informally reopening. And these people are not all the people. They're not the doctors who counsel caution. They're not the state governors who are terrified of votes being washed away by a post-reopening second wave of casualties. Of course, they're not the state employees who really can depend on their jobs. But these people are, as he says, all calling the bluff of their elected leaders and unelected experts, first in the parks and in the beaches, next in the shops and offices. He says, we are already seeing civil disobedience on a barely containable scale. It will only accelerate as the sun comes out, the deaths pile up, and the curve of the death rate flattens. He isn't necessarily, nor am I saying that all of this is good, by the way, but it's just a reality that, government can only do so much. As I've said, if 3 people, or in the case of Shelley Luther, 1 person defies an order, well, that's real easy to go after them. If 3 dozen people do, a lot more difficult. 100 people, it's out of the question. And there is a sense in which that we are going to, if nothing else, maybe have people say, well, I told you so, but we already knew that anyway. I don't know how many times we have to say this, but the flattening of the curve was not to protect people. If we kept everybody in lockdown and even drove all of the governments that are around to bankruptcy and drove everybody to poverty, eventually, one way or another, people are going to get the virus. The flattening was to say that it didn't overwhelm the system. But the reality is that until we have a proven vaccine, which, as we've pointed out before, may never happen with a coronavirus, then there are going to be people that are going to die. and people are dying every single day of things other than the coronavirus. And it isn't like it's perfect right now with the lockdown, because we already recognize that because people aren't getting various tests and they're not necessarily catching cancers because they're not doing mammograms, they're not doing colonoscopies, they're not doing biopsies, those individuals later on are going to suffer. Of course, not to mention, as we've pointed out before, that as the unemployment rates rise, the death rates rise for all sorts of reasons, on everything from, of course, drug addictions to suicides. And so, again, the point he makes is that the virus is still spreading, people are still dying, and as Germany discovered, even a managed reopening accelerates the dynamics of the contagion. What we're seeing, though, are two approaches to risk management. The cautious and technocratic reduction of risk at scale is issuing orders, but a large number of people, by necessity or habit, are playing the odds. And so, nevertheless, we do have an individual, the judge in this particular case, apparently good friends with Barack Obama. I've seen some pictures of the two of them together. Wanted to make sure that if she was not going to apologize, that temporary restraining order would be continued, and more importantly, that she was booked into the Dallas County Jail and will serve time. There are, of course, people right now putting out petitions trying to see if the governor will pardon her. But nevertheless, that is where we find ourselves locally. But this story of Shelley Luther is not just a local story now. It is a national story. And how many times does that happen, where something starts when we're talking about this locally in Dallas, and it then becomes a national conversation as well? Speaking of that, let's, if we can, go to many of the articles that I've posted here today. But as a program note, let me just tell you a couple of things. First of all, in the next hour, we're going to talk about Jordan Peterson. Yes, I'd love to have Dr. Jordan Peterson on by himself, but Dr. Ron Dart has written a piece. Actually, it is an editorial collection of editorial pieces, some written by people that have actually been on this program, others that are not. And they're trying to look at the myth and meaning in Jordan Peterson, and it's called A Christian Perspective. Now, when we say Christian, I'm talking about the broadest sense of the word. As I read some of these individuals, I'm saying, okay, they maybe aren't quite the orthodox evangelicals that we like to interview here, but they're trying to give a context to Jordan Peterson, who has become a phenomenon. And if you don't know who he is, of course, I've got his most famous book now, 12 Rules for Life. And it is amazing to me that somebody who really comes essentially from a non-Christian perspective, but he comes up with, in many cases, Christian conclusions, Judeo-Christian answers, which I think prove, as we've said on this program so many times before, that really if you have an individual that uses a little bit of common sense, and they're not trying to cater to political correctness, and Jordan Peterson certainly is not trying to do that, and they're not getting involved in this postmodern idea, and he's certainly not doing that, you're eventually going to come to a lot of Christian conclusions, even if you don't start from Christian presuppositions. And we saw that in an interview we did a while back with one of the co-authors of The Coddling of the American Mind, Jonathan Haidt. Interestingly enough, not a Christian either, although co-authored the book with a Christian. But nevertheless, as we were working our way through that, Nick Pitts and I were saying time and time again, we agreed with some of his conclusions, even if he's starting from obviously a different point of view. So we'll be talking about that in the next hour. And then for those of you that want to stick around for the third hour, Larry Taylor, who has, of course, been individual we've had on the program in the past as head of the Prestonwood Christian Academy, is now the president of the Association of Christian Schools International. We're going to be talking about ACSI, the Association of Christian Schools International, and distance learning and homeschooling and Christian schooling, a variety of things that I think you're going to find very interesting. So that will be the case. But back to some of the articles I've posted. The first one I just jokingly said, where's the beef? Because Wendy's is running out of beef. And that gets us into some of the incredible interruptions in the food supply that have taken place. Then we're going to look at the pandemic political shift, social distancing, and much, much more. All that coming up right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Should the rest of the country have to play by New York rules? Brett Stevens doesn't think so. He lives in New York City and writes for the New York Times, but he understands why most of America doesn't want to live under a national lockdown just because of how the virus pandemic has slammed New York. He begins by reminding us of the famous cover for The New Yorker with the title View of the World from 9th Avenue. Manhattan is in the foreground, there's a brownie strip called Jersey, and the rest of America is in the distance. He says that could almost be a map for the epidemic. When he wrote the column, there are more fatalities in Long Island's Nassau County with a population of 1.4 million than in all of California with a population of 40 million. There were more fatalities in Westchester County, 989, than in Texas, 611. Virus deaths per 100,000 in New York City were more than 16 times what could be found in America's next largest city, Los Angeles. Why so many infections and deaths in New York City? Well, it has the highest population density among U.S. cities of 100,000 or more. Commuters crowd trains, office workers crowd elevators, diners crowd restaurants. No other city has the same kind of jammed pedestrian life as New York. He understands why so much of the country is ready to open up and has dwindling sympathy for lockdown conditions that may still be necessary for New York City for the near future. He also acknowledges that his argument goes against his personal interest. He believes people in safe suburban neighborhoods should not be prevented from returning to their jobs just because he and others choose to live, travel, and work in what he calls urban sardine cans. That's why we should not have to play by New York rules. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Socialism, go to viewpoints.info/socialism. That's viewpoints.info/socialism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, just before I get into some of these articles, let me just mention that our email on Pray for America went out about 10 minutes ago, so check your inbox right now if you've already subscribed to our Pray for America events. And if you have not, can I encourage you right now to go to the website, pointofview.net, and on the right-hand side it says Pray for America Subscribe, and that's an opportunity for you to subscribe. It's very simple. We just give your name and email, and then we like to send you various prayer targets. And, of course, tomorrow is the National Day of Prayer, originally established, as we mentioned yesterday, in 1952, and especially with the COVID-19 and the virus pandemic and some of the economic dislocation. If there's ever been a time for us to pray for this nation, it is certainly now. So I wanted to mention that that is coming out, and I would encourage you to look at that, to pray about it. If you have not subscribed, take the time to do so. And while I'm doing this, I'm going to mention this a couple times today because I know people tune in and tune out. Yesterday, you might remember that we had April Chastain on the program, and we talked about an opportunity for you to watch the National Day of Prayer locally here at the Hope Center. And you can go to thehopecenter.org. It will be taking place at noon. And so you can either watch it on the Hope Center website, or I suspect most of you have a Facebook account. You can simply go to the Hope Center link there on Facebook and watch that. And it's just kind of a who's who of individuals that will be speaking and praying. And so many of you might have said, you know, I never could make it to one of these local Pray for America National Day of Prayer events because I was working or just was on the other end of town. Here, all you have to do is have access to a computer and you're good. So that was the first one, and we mentioned that yesterday, and I will mention it again today, that it's at noon. Tomorrow night, I think you really want to watch on television or again on Facebook. There's a lot of ways to get this. The National Day of Prayer from Washington, D.C., and this is the one hosted by the Presidential Prayer Team. And as I understand, Will Graham, the evangelist for the Billy Graham organization, will be there. He's the grandson of the late Billy Graham. And, matter of fact, you've seen him in some of the movies as well. We're going to have all sorts of people praying. I've got a list here. Nick Hall, Harry Jackson, Andrew Palau, Luis Palau, Rick Warren, Billy Wilson. Matter of fact, I need to make the list because I know that Eric Metaxas, who we interviewed yesterday, is going to be doing that. I know Jack Graham is. I'm going to have to go get the whole list, but that's the short list right now, and that's taking place 8 o'clock Eastern, or really 7 o'clock Central. And I think Daystar's covering it. Of course, again, if you have access to a computer, it's going to be on Facebook and a number of other things. And you can simply go to nationaldayofprayer.org and find out about that one. So 2 very significant events. The HopeCenter.org, which is at noon tomorrow, and then the one 7 o'clock tomorrow night from 7 to 9, as I understand it, May 7th in the evening. And you can go to the nationaldayofprayer.org. So those are some prayer targets. And if you have not signed up for Pray for America, let me encourage you to do so. Okay, back to the news here. Wendy's is running out of burgers. This one is interesting, and I love how Brad Palumbo puts it. First, we ran out of toilet paper. Now we're running out of hamburgers, ? And we're starting to have serious problems with the meat supply chain due to meat packing plant shutdowns and pre-existing regulatory dysfunction. By the way, some people are convinced that some of this has to do with some of the regulations, and I won't get into all that because that's almost worth an entire program sometime in the future. But the attempt by the president to address this is by classifying meat packing plants as essential, pushing to keep them open. But again, part of it has to do with some of these regulations that are oftentimes slowing down the opportunity. Michael Brendan Doherty put it this way: America's meat processing plants are hard hit by COVID-19. Speculation runs that the immigrant laborers are less aware of health precautions given in English, and that their living situations and the elbow-to-elbow nature of the work are making them especially vulnerable. And you've seen some memes going out there on Facebook saying, look at all the hundreds of thousands of people that work in the grocery stores and Walmart, and nobody's getting sick and nobody's dying, which, by the way, is wrong, but nevertheless, that's what the meme says. And then look at some of these meat processing plants shutting down. Well, it's because they are different. They unfortunately have a different set of circumstances, which I just mentioned a minute ago. And this, in some respects, could really backfire against the reelection plans of Donald Trump. Because as this particular article by Michael Brendan Doherty says, this is the first time since the 1970s oil crisis that Americans, maybe on a mass scale, will be exposed to rationing, shortages, and long lines. And that did not bode well for Jimmy Carter. First of all, not very well for, even before that, Gerald Ford, but then Jimmy Carter. But again, because of these critical infrastructure problems, in some cases in the meat processing plants, we may actually find it more and more difficult to find a hamburger. And so that is the case. And so the sight, they are saying, of empty meat counters at supermarkets alongside images of unslaughtered cattle or poultry actually being buried rather than taken there could be something. And unless you think, well, can't we solve this worldwide? The United States, Brazil, and Canada, are you ready for this? Account for 65% of the world meat trade. In other words, 2/3 of the meat provided to everybody around the world comes either from the U.S., Canada, or Brazil. I didn't know that. That's pretty interesting. And, of course, the meat shortage, as this author says, is not Donald Trump's fault. But that doesn't mean anything because the concentration of meat processing and packing industries and even some of the lack of issued information to those individuals working there Nevertheless, we tend to blame the person in power, and so this may indeed be a real problem for the reelection of the president, if indeed that is one of the issues that may really begin to surface more significantly in the summer and the fall. And again, Tyson Foods were the ones that were talking about the fact that the food chain is indeed breaking, and so as a result, that is a concern as well. And then you have, of course, food banks, which are supporting right now a lot of individuals who are out of work, and they have about a increase of about 70% demand that they've never seen before. Sometimes locations normally serving 200 cars a day now struggle with lines stretching for miles, even as they face about a 30% decrease in food donations because of that. And so you have this situation which you have kind of the surplus of food, but because of the structure of the, if you will, supply chains, you have the food, but you can't get it to them. And at the other point, you had some that were actually producing food for a mass scale. Recognize, let's use the potato example. The National Potato Council reports having about $1.3 billion worth of potatoes, but you know, how do you get them to the right places? Because those potatoes were going to be used in restaurants, which are closed, in schools, which are closed, and then trying to get those processed to even the food banks has become a great challenge there as well. And you might say, well, let's have the federal government jump in. Well, the Department of Agriculture actually has a program. It has, or had, I should say, $3 billion in excess meat and produce each year that it will purchase so that it makes it available to the food banks. But guess what? That was drained a long time ago. So this just illustrates again the whole issue of where's the beef, and it is a significant issue indeed. Yesterday we had Gary Bauer on, and I thought I just might mention something that we talked about in the third hour, but maybe you didn't have a chance to hear, and that is talking about the fact that the president has actually been trying to get American companies to look for an alternative to China. He actually started doing that last summer. And don't you think now that makes a great deal of sense? Matter of fact, that was one of our action items to bring some of the supply chains back to the United States and away from China as well. And as a result, we're not only running into those issues, running into the fact that even when we do get some of the supplies from China, they have been defective. We've had, matter of fact, all sorts of different imported masks from China that failed to meet U.S. safety standards. And it hasn't just affected us. Canada recently discovered that the 1 million Chinese masks that they were able to get from China were unfit for use. And yet that hasn't slowed everybody down. California Governor Gavin Newsom just actually gave Chinese a $1 billion contract to produce masks. I hope he does a little bit of a fact check on that, because indeed there are some real concerns. We come back, I want to talk a little bit more about a couple of things we discussed with Gary Bauer on 2 o'clock yesterday. And since some of you didn't have a chance to hear it, a couple of things of real concern. So we'll talk about those issues right after these important messages.
2020. Is there anything important happening this year? Well, not unless you consider major disputes in various Christian denominations, international tensions over a flu epidemic, economic uncertainties, and a presidential election important. Question: where will you get real news, credible opinion, clear biblical thinking on the things that matter most? Answer: Point of View Radio with Kerby Anderson and the team. You can make sure their voices continue speaking loud and clear by taking a moment right now and joining the Truth Team. It's easy, but you do have to visit our website or make a quick call. Go to pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. You have the power to make a difference. Joining the Truth Team can help ensure that millions of people will get a different opinion from the major purveyors of fake news. We don't get big advertising dollars like the networks or tax money like PBS. We depend on you. pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
If you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. First article we posted there has to do, of course, with the issue of beef, but I thought just before we get into some of the other articles I've posted, I would just give you a little bit of a comment or two from what we talked about yesterday with Gary Bauer, and one of those, which I thought was so striking, is something that I actually saw on Tucker Carlson the day before, and that is Representative Matt Gaetz, who is a representative out of the state of Florida, is actually very concerned about these drones that are being used by law enforcement. By the way, this is not the first time. If you go back and do a search, as I did last night, these were warnings that were coming out years ago, even going into the Obama administration. But there was always a concern that some of these Chinese-made drones, and most of the drones available right now do come from China. A lot of them come from DJI, which is a Chinese technology company, actually could be sending and probably are sending information back. So here you have people in law enforcement that have been using these drones to police individuals during the coronavirus pandemic, and yet that could actually be in some way or another beginning to compromise our national security. So what Matt Gaetz talks about is, first of all, the danger. Now he's even calling on the Attorney General William Barr to order the grounding of all these China-connected DJI drones. And one of the things Gary Bauer calls this is that this might be a Chinese Trojan horse. We have seen how, as he says, some of these high-tech companies like Google and Facebook, the so-called big tech, that actually have in one way or another cooperated with the Chinese Communist government. But now you have these drone manufacturers out of China that are being used by the police. And in some respects, DJI have really dominated the market. And I've been looking at this a little bit myself. I love doing photography, and I've always thought it would be fun to have one of those drones. I have a friend that has quite a number of those drones, and the thing that keeps me from it is, first of all, the cost. Second of all, unless you get a really small drone, you have to register it, and theoretically you should even go through a course. And then worst of all, you fly that drone into a tree and you can't get it back, or it lands in the water, you just lost. So there are a lot of good reasons to have questions about whether or not you want to buy one of those drones, but they make, great presents for individual. You get some great shots and pictures, and if you want to get an overhead shot and not have to hire a helicopter company to get those, this is the best way, actually even the best way, because you couldn't even fly a helicopter close to some of the things you'd want to get pictures of. But now we are starting to recognize that DJI over the years has drastically cut its prices, which means the drones are less expensive than the American-made ones, so they could drive many American manufacturers out of business. And so there really is a concern now as to whether or not some of these drones themselves might be a possible Trojan horse. So just one other thing to mention. And the last one that I mentioned the other day with Gary Bauer was the fact that on Monday, the Pulitzer Prize was given to an individual who has been writing for the 619 Project. And if you're not familiar with that, the argument from the New York Times is America was not founded in 1620 with the Pilgrims. It was founded in 1619 when the first slave arrived in Jamestown. And so the whole argument is that slavery is the reason that we have our economic might, our industrial power, even our electoral system, all of which is just as fallacious as can be. But nevertheless, the introductory essay by Nicole Hannah-Jones won the Pulitzer Prize. And what is so interesting, as we've pointed out, is that you have other black historians, and I quoted one yesterday, Leslie Harris at Northwestern, who agreed with the 1619 Project, but was just appalled that Nicole Hannah-Jones says that the reason the Revolutionary War was fought was so that the institution of slavery could remain intact, which is false on its face as you can imagine. As the example I love to use is, if you look at the first draft of the Declaration of Independence by Thomas Jefferson, there's a line in there about abolishing the slave trade, which was not kept in the final version because delegates from South Carolina and Georgia objected to it. Hannah Jones goes on to claim that President Abraham Lincoln opposed black equality, and just after a while, it is beyond even an understanding. And of course, one of the things we talk about is the fact that after this essay came out, the New York Times even had to change it. And I love what Andrew Sullivan, who's really a liberal columnist, homosexual and progressive on all sorts of issues, said, how many Pulitzer Prizes have gone to essays that have had to subsequently be corrected or been challenged by every major historian in the field, right and center and left? And if you think about this, you have some of the most eminent professors at Princeton. How about at Brown University? Gordon Wood, an individual that's well known. Princeton, like James McPherson, James Oakes. I mean, just go down this long list of individuals, some of the most respected historians in America, all who have rejected this. And yet, there's a good example, and maybe I'll do a commentary on it, of where the Pulitzer Prize was awarded, interestingly enough, to an essay that had to be changed because it was so full of errors that it still won the Pulitzer Prize, which I think just shows the infection in some respects of the 1619 Project, and also the devaluation, rather dramatic devaluation of the Pulitzer Prize. But let's get to my second article here. This one comes from Grady Means, who is arguing that because of this pandemic, Grady Means suggests that maybe indeed there's going to be a shift to the right, shift to more conservative ideas. He writes that the coronavirus has led to the greatest economic catastrophe in our lifetimes, record losses in the market, record bankruptcies, record unemployment, and soon record insolvency in the local governments. And so, first of all, he says there's no more money. The huge bailouts strained the budget and debt capacity of America to the limit. It's difficult to imagine how the country will be able to dodge substantial inflation. There'll certainly be calls for cutting the budget. And so you will no longer be allowed, I think, to say, oh, yeah, we have all the money. We have unemployment at 3%. We have the economy really booming. No, you don't. And you don't really have the ability to raise taxes because a lot of those people simply don't even have a job in the first place. Second, he argues that it's likely that many local governments will become insolvent. The argument and the plea right now from some of these blue states, which have already had problems with their pension plans, we've talked about this on my commentaries before, simply aren't going to be able to get the money from the federal government. They're not going to be able to get it from property tax. They're not going to be able to get it from sales tax. And so as a result, that is almost eliminating the possibility of any kind of sales tax increase. And so you're going to have a level of insolvency like you've never seen before. Third, a significant number of colleges and universities will collapse. Endowments have taken a hit. Tuition revenue has been cut. Students are unwilling to pay full tuition and fees for online courses, you think. And they're already a pushback of building against high tuitions and resulting mountains of college debt. And just think about this. Let's just assume that you're a small liberal arts college and you expect to get about 3,000 freshmen in every year. And let's say you this time get 2,000 in. Well, it's not just that you lose the income from those 1,000 students in the freshman year, because it also shows up in your sophomore year, in your junior year, and in your senior year. As a matter of fact, as you begin to have to cut back services and maybe even raise tuition, that 2,000 might eventually become 1,500. And so now you are trying to actually manage the entire college or university on half the income. You can do the math and figure that one out. And then he also points out that the medical care is on a similar trajectory. Restrictive pandemic policies outlawing elective surgery and discouraging many of the sick from visiting emergency rooms is bringing on a financial collapse of very significant parts of the American health care system. And if you don't think that is important, simply go to my Viewpoints commentary that came out just a few days ago that dealt with the issue of
the bankruptcies in many of these hospitals. By the way, my Viewpoints commentary today is New York rules, and that's an argument that was made, and I mentioned it last week, by Brett Stevens, writing for the New York Times, living in New York, saying, look, it's not fair for the rest of the country to live by New York rules. We have a situation that is relatively unique, and you can't tell somebody in Wyoming they can't open up their economy when we are still dealing with subways where people are being infected, and we are dealing with a very significant number of infections and deaths that are not found probably anywhere else in the country in terms of the number of infections per 100,000 or even the number of deaths per 100,000. So we shouldn't have to live by New York rules. Let's take a break. We got a lot more to cover. We'll do so right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes, and then, as I mentioned before, we're going to be talking about Jordan Peterson the next hour, and we'll also be talking with Dr. Larry Taylor, who's now the president of the Association of Christian Schools International, the hour after that. Last two articles we've posted here. One, the failed experiment of social distancing, and then a piece by Dennis Prager, both of whom are very critical of what we've done in terms of the lockdown, so I'll give you that ahead of time. But nevertheless, Julie Kelly argues that this is an experiment. And she says, you would say, what, an experiment? She says, we've been assured by the credential class that keeping a distance of 6 feet between healthy people for weeks on end was the only tried and true way to prevent the deadly spread of the novel coronavirus. Now, again, that may be a little bit of a misstatement, because the original argument was this helps us maybe manage our health resources and we won't crash the healthcare system. But if you think it prevents the spread of it, that is not something that you can really find very good documentation. And so you can read this in its entirety, but on the third page, she points out that if you even go to the website for the Centers for Disease Control, there are no links of any peer-reviewed social distancing studies that actually bolster that statement. And if you go to the CDC and even the World Health Organization, there is a little bit of uncertainty even now about how COVID-19 and how the virus is spread, and raising questions about the issue of social distancing. And then later on in the piece, she points out that if you go back and do a Google search, and I've never taken the time to do this, but I think this is kind of intriguing, you can find a group of scientists back in 2006. And again, I recognize that's 14 years ago. Maybe we've learned some things since then. But back then, researchers at the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center said it has been recommended that individuals maintain a distance, are you ready for this, of 3 feet or more during a pandemic so as to diminish the number of contacts with people that may be infected. The efficacy of this measure is what? Unknown. So first of all, the article talks about 3 feet and unknown. And so you might say, well, do they stand by that? Well, it turns out now 2 individuals that were part of that original study now, because she argues, because Donald Trump is the president, have now come back and said, no, staying 6 feet apart, wearing masks in public, avoiding large gatherings to the extent we're able to do so over the next few months will dictate how we do as states. So that is kind of a little bit of a change of tune, although it is so reminiscent of what we ran into. If you remember the mask, we were told, masks really don't work. And then all of a sudden we're told everybody's supposed to wear a mask. So you have these individuals at Pittsburgh, I'm going to dig out a little bit more, that were saying, we're not even sure the social distancing really works. And they were using 3 feet. Now we've got to be safe. Now we're talking about 6 feet. And it's just intriguing to actually do a little bit of an investigation into where some of these ideas came from. Just before we end, though, let me also quote from Dennis Prager. As you know, he has been somebody who has been very critical of the lockdown. And the title of his piece probably illustrates it only so well. The worldwide lockdown may be the greatest mistake in history. Okay, that sounds like a little bit much, but here's his point. He says that the idea that the worldwide lockdown of virtually every country other than Sweden, which we talked about yesterday, may have been an enormous mistake strikes many, including world leaders, most scientists, especially health officials, doctors, and epidemiologists, those who work in major news media, opinion writers in the media, and hundreds of millions, if not billions, of people who put their faith in these people as so prosperous as to be immoral. And he says that this is a mistake. And he says for people that don't understand the English language or logic, he really's got to get his dig in there, mistake does not mean evil. He says massive mistakes are made by arrogant fools. Massive evils are committed by evil people. So he's pointing out that this may be a mistake, but it's not that people intended that, although I'm sure we'll always hear people say that as well. And then he goes on to just remind us that even for maybe us in this country, it may be an inconvenience, or it may be hard for some people to find food, but let's start looking at what this has done worldwide. And so by the time you get to his 4th paragraph, he says the United Nations World Food Program states that by the end of the year, more than 260 million people will face starvation, double last year's figures. You might remember we were talking about the fact that we were getting to the point where we're almost eliminating extreme poverty because of capitalism, because of a free market, and eliminating a great deal of starvation. That is now much worse. According to the director of the World Food Program, we could be looking at famine in about 36 countries. There is also a real danger that more people will potentially die from the economic impact of COVID-19 than from the virus itself. And of course, he puts that in italics, which he adds to make the point. And if the global GDP declines by 5%, which I think seems likely, another 147 million people will be plunged into extreme poverty. Remember when we were actually talking about just a few months ago raising virtually everybody out of extreme poverty except to those places where there was civil war and we could not get to them? And so the argument he makes later on is that the lockdown is possibly even more catastrophic than the virus in its outcome, because you now have the collapse of the global food supply systems and widespread human starvation. And so, again, this comes from one of the workers that is working in that area in Bangladesh. And so he points out that the way we are seeing people respond to this, even in some areas, is to simply talk about this as merely an inconvenience. If you look, for example, at the issue of the nation, one of the individuals, a Reverend William Barber, a Protestant minister and a president of the North Carolina NAACP, referred to, "May we who are merely inconvenienced remember those whose lives are at stake." And so when you first of all see all these numbers, and I've left a lot of them out in terms of the number of people locked down, how the coronavirus has killed so many people in various countries, but the lockdown has killed many more. And he uses a good example from India. And he's got all sorts of examples that remind us that, yeah, maybe it's a little bit of an inconvenience for people that are wealthy in America, but it is absolutely devastating around the world. And so to refer to that as merely inconvenienced is akin to only be looking at it from, if you will, American perspective and not in terms of the world perspective. And so Michael Levitt, who's the professor of structural biology at Stanford Medical School and the winner of the Nobel Prize in Chemistry back in 2013, said, "No doubt in my mind that when we come to look back on this, the damage done by the lockdown will exceed any saving of lives by a huge factor." Only time will tell, but that, I thought, was just another article that might want to put on the table for you to consider, to read in its entirety, and to put in with all the other things that we've had a chance to talk about today. If nothing else, that should cause us to really want to pray for America, pray for our leaders, and that's why we sent out an email to those of you that have signed up. But if you have not subscribed, take the time to go to the website, pointofview.net, and get our prayer updates. And that one went out just about an hour ago. And as I mentioned also, I hope that tomorrow you might, at noon, want to watch the virtual National Day of Prayer through the Hope Center, thehopecenter.org. And tomorrow night, watch the event hosted by the Presidential Prayer Team. It will take place at 7 p.m., and it will be an individual, well, just kind of a who's who of individuals that will be praying for our nation. Let's take a break, though. We're going to spend some time talking about Jordan Peterson and a variety of other topics. So if you'd like to know more about some of the things we've covered, simply go to the website, pointofview.net. We'll be back with more right after this.
When you give to Point of View, does it make a difference? Jeremy Dyes would tell you that it does. He grew up listening to Point of View in the back seat of his mom's car, and it helped to shape his thinking.
I had parents that were able to sit across from me at the dinner table after we listened to Marlon Maddox and Kerby Anderson years ago and think through what the scriptures say about these issues of current significance in our lives. That's only possible because Point of View has come along and ministered into my life and made me who I am today. And here I am today defending religious liberty, partly because Marlon Maddox and Penn Dexter and Kerby Anderson were the ones that were pushing me towards all that. They taught me how to think through these issues. They didn't tell me what to think. They taught me how to think.
Each gift you give will change lives. Not every Point of View listener will become a Jeremy, but if they listen for very long, they will be changed. And that will change how they impact and affect the lives of the people around them. So make that decision to change a life today. Join the Truth Team and boldly stand for truth in a world of lies, distortion, and information manipulation. Go to pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. That's 1-800-347-5151.
Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining us. This is the Wednesday edition of Point of View, and in just a few minutes we're going to talk about Jordan Peterson, a new book that comes out about him. And if you know who he is, I think you'll probably be fascinated, because here is an individual that obviously doesn't come from a Christian point of view. But even though he doesn't have Christian assumptions, so many of his conclusions are ones that Christians would adopt and agree with. And so we'll be talking about this book, Myth and Meaning, and Jordan Peterson, a Christian perspective. I think you'll find that very helpful. Next hour, we're going to be talking with Dr. Larry Taylor, and he's been with us before, has been, of course, the president and the head of the Prestonwood Christian Academy, but now is the president of the Association of Christian Schools International. We're going to talk about what that might mean as well. And I'll get into the issue of distant learning, and then we'll talk again about the pandemic and about some of the food issues. One of the articles I've posted, I just kind of fancifully titled, "Where's the Beef?" because we have not only Wendy's but others running out of hamburgers and meat, and what that might mean. We'll get into the issue of social distancing and much, much more. Let me just mention, though, real quickly, that tomorrow is the National Day of Prayer. And about an hour ago, sent out an email giving you some information about this National Day of Prayer, which was begun back in 1952. And in light of all the things we've been talking about over the last couple of months, this is certainly a time to be praying for our country. So I wanted to make sure that you were looking for that email. And if you have not received it, that may be an indication that you need to go to our website, pointofview.net, and click on that button that says subscribe, because we want to send you, of course, various prayer targets. And tomorrow, of course, the National Day of Prayer has usually been one where we've encouraged you to go to one of the 60,000 different local community events. Those are not taking place, but I have encouraged people to go and participate in some of these virtual National Day of Prayer, one of those being done by the Hope Center, which is in the kind of Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex at noon Central Time. Of course, it would be 1 o'clock Eastern all the way to 10 o'clock Pacific Time. And you go to thehopecenter.org. But all of us, I think, may want to, tomorrow night, go to our television sets or to a Facebook place where the National Day of Prayer will be hosted from Washington, D.C., The actual host will be Will Graham, who is the grandson of the late Billy Graham and part of the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association. We're going to hear from Nick Hall and Harry Jackson and Luis Palau and Rick Warren and Billy Wilson and Eric Metaxas, who was on the program with us yesterday, and Jack Graham, who was on with us about a week or two ago, and all sorts of other individuals. And so I would encourage you to find out more about these various events, even though you cannot actually participate in something other than the virtual event. This may be an even greater opportunity for you to hear and to pray with these various leaders across the country. So that's just a brief overview of what is going to be taking place tomorrow. We'll talk about more of that tomorrow, but I did want to give you some advance notice as we get into the conversations today. First of all, let's, if we can, welcome to the microphone Dr. Ron Dart. He has been teaching in the Department of Political Science, Philosophy, and Religious Studies at the University of Fraser Valley. That's such a beautiful place, by the way. I've spent a summer there at Regent College at the University of British Columbia. I've also spoken in various events around the Fraser Valley, and so that is certainly a great and beautiful place. And an individual that also was on the staff in the past with Amnesty International and has edited this book on Jordan Peterson, which is endorsed by all sorts of individuals that have been on this program. Daniel Darling, for example, gives his endorsement. John Stonestreet, who's on with us on a regular basis. First chapter by Bruce Ashford, who's been on the program, and many others that I think you will really appreciate. And so, Ron Dart, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Oh, delight to be with you.
Let's, if we can, maybe talk about how you first heard about him, and that is, I think you had some students that wanted to do papers on Jordan Peterson. I was also hearing people talk about him, so I started watching, YouTube videos. And as a matter of fact, for those of you watching online, you can see I'm holding up my copy of Jordan Peterson's book, 12 Rules for Life. But in some respects, he has become kind of a phenomenon. And from time to time, I've had people ask, what do you think about Jordan Peterson? So now I can point them to your book. So tell us a little bit more about how you first heard about him.
Well, I'd heard about him going back to the 90s, particularly his big tome, Maps of Meaning.
Yes.
But it was mostly a book that appealed to people more within the confines of an academic world and grappling with the issues of meaning and meaninglessness, and seemed to be the dimming of maps of meaning. But so that he tended to for a significant amount of period of time, stay within that more confined world of the academic, the intellectual world of conferences. But by 2016, he really appeared on the intellectual, cultural, social stage in a much more prominent way. And then by 2017, he was giving all these lectures on Genesis. And so I had a variety of students come to me. I mean, probably he's had a greater impact than any other thinker on my students, some who grew up in Christian backgrounds, but they left and wandered far afield, and he played a very significant role in drawing them back, like a Virgil, to Christianity,
yes.
Midwifing them in that sense. And then I've had a whole range of other students with a totally secular background who had sort of the notion of the sacred, the Bible. Christianity was something, well, come on, when the Enlightenment, we've grown beyond all of that sort of stuff. And he has pointed out very clearly the perennial significance of the Bible, of Christianity. And so I've had two types of students who became quite interested, wanted to do class presentations, essays on Jordan Peterson and what he has meant to them in their journey to Christianity and how he has transformed their lives. And so through students coming to me in a more popular way, it made me interested in terms of, well, this is impacting them. So I try, as a teacher, you try and be sensitive to your students' souls and their longings and their desires and their direction as they fumble and feel their way. And so Peterson was very important in that sense as a midwife for them. So as a result of that, I started even doing more work in listening to Peterson and working with some of the material, his lectures, and much else.
Let's, if we can, take a break. When we come back, though, I wanted to maybe say that some of the way in which he got the most amount of attention is, first of all, critiquing what you might call postmodern thought. And most importantly, probably even more than that, really taking on political correctness. I mean, he sort of was sort of the individual that everybody wanted to attack from the liberal side because he was saying, you know what, I'm just not going to use these transgender pronouns that you're telling me that I have to use. And by the way, I think some of the things you feminists are saying doesn't make sense. Some of this isn't very logical. And as a result, he really gained a following fairly quickly. And in some respects, I think people have been drawn to him, not necessarily because they always agree with everything he has to say, but they just love the fact that finally that somebody in the academic world was coming up and beginning to critique some of the silliness, I guess I could use the word, some of the bizarre ideas that are actually promoted in the university. So we'll come back and talk about that with Dr. Ron Dart right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Should the rest of the country have to play by New York rules? Brett Stevens doesn't think so. He lives in New York City and writes for the New York Times, but he understands why most of America doesn't want to live under a national lockdown just because of how the virus pandemic has slammed New York. He begins by reminding us of the famous cover for The New Yorker with the title View of the World from 9th Avenue. Manhattan is in the foreground, there's a brownie strip called Jersey, and the rest of America is in the distance. He says that could almost be a map for the epidemic. When he wrote the column, there are more fatalities in Long Island's Nassau County with a population of 1.4 million than in all of California with a population of 40 million. There were more fatalities in Westchester County, 989, than in Texas, 611. Virus deaths per 100,000 in New York City were more than 16 times what could be found in America's next largest city, Los Angeles. Why so many infections and deaths in New York City? Well, it has the highest population density among U.S. cities of 100,000 or more. Commuters crowd trains, office workers crowd elevators, diners crowd restaurants. No other city has the same kind of jammed pedestrian life as New York. He understands why so much of the country is ready to open up and has dwindling sympathy for lockdown conditions that may still be necessary for New York City for the near future. He also acknowledges that his argument goes against his personal interest. He believes people in safe suburban neighborhoods should not be prevented from returning to their jobs just because he and others choose to live, travel, and work in what he calls urban sardine cans. That's why we should not have to play by New York rules. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Socialism, go to viewpoints.info/socialism. That's viewpoints.info/socialism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Our topic today is Jordan Peterson, and if you say, well, I really haven't heard much about him, I just did a search, a Google search, and his name shows up 68 million times on the internet. I did a quick search on YouTube, and there's over 400 YouTube videos of him. So some people have said he's a kind of a cultural phenomenon, and in some respects, as our guest, Dr. Ron Dart, points out, back in about 2016, this professor at the University of Toronto kind of ended up on the public stage, in part because he was very upset about being forced to use gender-neutral pronouns and compelled speech. And so in some respects, that's what gave him, if you will, a national or international platform. But for some time, he's been critical of this idea of postmodernism and political correctness, hasn't he?
Yes, there's a history going back to his many presentations on TV Ontario and other forms of video and YouTube presentations he's done. He's been concerned with two wings of liberalism that he's focused on, and basically said the emperor has no clothes on if you look at them more closely. One would be the one element of postmodern liberalism is the notion that there is no order, there is no structure, there is no right or wrong. We all just have perspectives, and those perspectives are conditioned by our culture, our history, where we grew up. And so right and wrong are purely contingent notions that only a certain class of people actually believe in. We're all products of history in that sense. So on the one hand, he's very concerned with that post-structural form of postmodernism. that essentially says all is a matter of, as I mentioned, just of outlook perspective. The other concern he has, which would be the flip side of liberalism, would be the social justice warriors that say these are the issues that a person and a group has to line up behind, and if you disagree with them, you're somewhat retrograde intellectually, you're still living in the caves. And he's very concerned with sort of almost the authoritarianism of that tendency and the means that these people will do in terms of rhetorically canon-hosing people who disagree with them. So between the fragmentary element of postmodernism in which nothing can be agreed upon and so that's one position taken. And the other is these are the 5, 6, 7, 8 issues. If you're at all going to be on the cutting edge of justice, you have to line up behind. And if a person doesn't line up behind that, it demonstrates that they're living in the dark ages in some ways. And his position has been, one is very authoritarian, leads to a lack of critical thinking. The other one is, in fact, we all do make positions that we tend to think are right and wrong. And to take the position that all things are relative is a highly problematic position, and that becomes its own absolute position.
Mm-hmm. You know, one of the things you just mentioned about this authoritarian position, I've seen him in debates where sometimes they'll say, well, why aren't you criticizing the alt-right or the conservatives because maybe they're authoritarian as well? And first of all, he says, well, there's two reasons for that. Reason number one is they're not in control of the universities. This is in control of a very small minority of politically correct liberals or progressives. Number two, frankly, I don't see them as half as authoritarian as you are. There is sometimes a little bit more of a live and let live kind of philosophy, especially, since we're talking about this from a Christian point of view. A lot of Christians might say, I may disagree with your view about same-sex marriage, but, if you want to live that way, fine. I'm not going to endorse everything you do, but I'm not going to come down on you, and I'm not going to be engaged in a cancel culture, or I'm not going to try to drive you out of your job. I'll just walk away and say, well, we just disagree. That is certainly not what you find on the radical elements, and that's where he's really kind of taken on this really authoritarian mindset, which not only happens in North America, certainly the United States and Canada, but it seems to have spread throughout the world, don't you think?
Yes, the point you're making is right, is that one of his concerns, given the fact he spent much of his academic career at Harvard and University of Toronto, he's aware that this ideology is very, very much at work. It's its own liberal Sanhedrin in that sense, its own liberal Mandarin class.
Well said,
and if you
yes.
differ with the orthodoxy of liberalism, you're going to be treated as Jesus was in the past. You're going to be crucified publicly. And he's dared, unlike many people of faith who sort of preach to the choir and, publish and do the conferences, but they're only talking to people who generally agree with them. Peterson has become bilingual in the sense that he knows the language of the broader liberal culture, and he knows it at its core, and he knows the vacuity at its core. But he also increasingly, he was raised in a Christian background up in northern Alberta in Fairview, he also knows that he broke from narrower Sunday school understandings of it, but he has grown also into understanding the importance of the biblical tradition and its relevance for people on their journey. I might say also that he is willing to critique elements of the right also.
Oh, sure.
Whether it's the light right or the alt-right. He comes from what we call a classical liberal tradition, and that critical thinking is important, and that critical thinking should not only be about free speech, but about true speech. And he's very interested in truth and what it means as a psychologist for people who have lost their bearings, lost their footing, and they don't know how to navigate in terms of life direction and the implications and consequences for people for that. So he's caught in this middle way. He's very nimble, but he's in this middle place that if people are ideologues of the right or the left, he'll be quite willing to take his lance, his intellectual lance, and be able to say, let's cut that a bit and see what comes out. And but as you say, the dominant Sanhedrin ideology of the time tends to be two forms of liberalism, which he has lived, moved, and had his being within. So he knows that world very well and wisely, and he sees the implications on students, and he sees the ripple effect of that in culture, in media, in politics, in parties. And so it's just not the university academic world. He sees the spillover effect on other spheres of public life, and he wants to say, if we're going to have meaningful public space, people should be able to ask critical questions about the ideology that perhaps they're immersed in and don't even have the critical faculties to engage with.
2 points, number one, to be able to ask questions. Some questions now are just simply off the table. You're not even allowed to ask those questions on a variety of topics. And then number two, the critical faculties. You as a professor have noticed that, I am sure. I used to speak on college campuses a lot more than I do now because I do this radio show, but just the inability sometimes of young people to necessarily even just follow kind of what you might call logic 101 kinds of ideas and follow the train of thought. So let's take a break. When we come back, though, I'd like to really delve into your chapter that deals with the idea of myth, but also try to explain an individual that, as you read through Jordan Peterson, 1 minute you are getting kind of Jungian psychology. The next minute you're getting a reference to Adam and Eve or Cain and Abel, and some people really have a little bit of trouble kind of finding their way through all of that. So we'll talk about this idea of myth and maybe even some of the archetypes and some of the other material that is there, the symbols and all the rest, and try to make some sense of him. Because if nothing else, one question I get from time to time, not so much as I used to, is what do you think about Jordan Peterson? And this is an attempt to put together a book. It's relatively short, but it has a number of different chapters, 10 chapters by individuals, some of whom have been on this program, that actually try to make sense of some of the things that you find in Jordan Peterson's books. And as I pull up again, for those of you watching online, Jordan Peterson's 12 Rules for Life, whether you look at his presuppositions or his conclusions, it is intriguing because, some of his chapters, stand up straight with your shoulders back, treat yourself like someone you're responsible for helping, make friends with people who want the best for you, set your house in perfect order before you criticize the world, tell the truth, be precise in your speech. These are ideas that I think we would certainly agree with, even if sometimes we wouldn't necessarily have the Jordan Peterson starting point. So I thought this would be an opportunity to consider an individual who's had a couple of best-selling books and certainly has made a cultural impact, which many of you have been asking about. And then in the next hour, we're going to get back into what is happening during this pandemic and what about distance learning and what can we do in terms of homeschooling. What can we do in the issue of the Christian school movement and others, and what that's going to mean for us as well as we talk with Dr. Larry Taylor. So we have a lot more to cover, and we will do so right after these important messages.
(2020). Is there anything important happening this year? Oh, not unless you consider major disputes in various Christian denominations, international tensions over a flu epidemic, economic uncertainties, and a presidential election important. Question: where will you get real news, credible opinion, clear biblical thinking on the things that matter most? Answer: Point of View Radio with Kerby Anderson and the team. You can make sure their voices continue speaking loud and clear by taking a moment right now and joining the Truth Team. It's easy, but you do have to visit our website or make a quick call. Go to pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. You have the power to make a difference. Joining the Truth Team can help ensure that millions of people will get a different opinion from the major purveyors of fake news. We don't get big advertising dollars like the networks or tax money like PBS. We depend on you. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
One of the individuals that is certainly making an impact on our culture, or at least has in the past, is Dr. Jordan Peterson, which is why we're spending just a little bit more time talking about him today. This book is entitled Myth and Meaning in Jordan Peterson, A Christian Perspective, and it has a series of essays, 10 different essays, some of which are written by individuals that have been on this program, and certainly the book itself is endorsed by people that have been part of Point of View as well. And so I thought this would be helpful to you. But also, let me open up the phones. Maybe you've had a chance to see maybe a debate or a discussion that he's been involved with in terms of watching a YouTube video. There are hundreds of those videos out. Maybe you've seen some of the material. Maybe you have a copy of his book, which I have right here in the studio, 12 Rules for Life, An Antidote to Chaos. And if you'd like to join us, we'd love to hear from you. 1-800-351-1212. It is a question I get from time to time. What do you think about, how is a Christian supposed to think about this person, Jordan Peterson? And so we go to the individual who not only wrote one of the essays, but is the editor of the book, Dr. Ron Dart. And we're talking about this idea of myth. And as you point out in the introduction there are people that just simply dismiss him, and so his detractors don't give him his due. Some of his fans maybe put him up on a pedestal. But your goal is to really get to this idea of myth, because anybody that reads through any of his books or hears him talking, one minute he's quoting from psychological research, the next minute he's quoting from the Bible. He's given whole lectures on the book of Genesis. A lot of people have trouble trying to make sense of all that, and as you point out in your chapter, one of those is to understand his view of myth. Can you help us out?
Yes. Well, first of all, there's a very popular understanding of myth in which myth is an illusion. It's a falsehood. It's not to be depended on. There's facts and there's myth. And there's statistics. And this is one approach in which there's this dichotomy between myth and hard facts. That's the popular understanding. Myth in its classical sense, going back to Plato and moving forward, certainly in Western intellectual history, at core, it's an eternal truth wrapped in the garments of a story. And so part of Peterson's interest is, so if you can hold on to this eternal truth sense, is that by the 19th century, some of the key thinkers were questioning whether there were anything such as eternal truth. So some of the late Victorian European thinkers, whether we're talking about Freud or Marx or Nietzsche, Weber, there's a whole bunch of cluster of thinkers intellectually that are actually paving the way forward to where elements of where the West was going, the late modern and postmodern liberalism, that basically said meaning, there's no such thing as eternal meaning or truth. It's something we invent or we're conditioned to believe or socialized. And so someone like a Carl Jung comes along, and there's many others as well, that basically says, no, in fact, there are deep structures in the human soul and spirit. And those stories those realities are revealed to us through stories or archetypes or myths. And to the degree we ignore those, it does great damage to the human soul, human identity, human society. And so Peterson is aware that most people don't have that cultural background anymore of the West. Most, if they've taken in myths, it's through Walt Disney or something else. So he'll start with myths they know, as any good teacher will, or truths they know, and then he moves them back step by step into the great classical myths of Western civilization and other civilizations for that matter. And so myth for him, drawing from Jung, and certainly Carl Jung's engagement for 5 years with Friedrich Nietzsche, a 5-year seminar. Peterson has a great interest in Nietzsche as well via Jung, and of course teaching. I teach courses in modern political thought from Erasmus up to Nietzsche. And many of my students, there's a great interest in people like Friedrich Nietzsche, and so a lot of it is finding, what are your students interested in? What is culture interested in? And then what are alternate ways of engaging people like that and taking them in directions? And for Peterson, for example, there are great eternal truths. Jung, in his engagement with Nietzsche, attempts, particularly Nietzsche's work, Thus Spake Zarathustra, to say, no, there are these truths, and here are the stories that if we internalize them and live forward, we live a meaningful life. If we don't, we go to cul-de-sacs, we go to dead ends, both in our soul and communities and friendships and family and society. And so for him, myths are an attempt to get at the maps of meaning, that to the degree we know how to follow them, it takes us to meaningful destinations in the human journey. That's why memoricide, my chapter is memoricide, is about people who really have no memory, and memory is a map of meaning. When we strip those maps away, then we don't know where to find meaning anymore, and that's where we are largely, he will argue, in our culture, as people go in all sorts of directions, many of them not so healthy or helpful, in a quest for meaning, and then they hit these cul-de-sacs and depression and loneliness and dead ends and isolation and suicide and drugs and all of these sort of things. So he said, if you don't know the maps that we have been given as a gift through history, if they're not internalized, then we create our own meaning maps, but they lack the credibility, the depth, the dependability that leads to a meaningful journey. And now look at the consequences. Do you like the consequences? No, then let's retrace ourselves, immerse ourselves in the great myths of the past, and perhaps we can reorient ourselves, our communities, our friendships, our families, our culture.
And again, when you talk about memoricide, or this idea we don't have any memory, there is this kind of mindset, especially among the young people. We do kind of a millennial roundtable here where we talk about Generation Y, Generation Z. Those are some of your students who are saying, well, I don't need to learn anything from the past. I just need to go and live my life now. And so as a result, you end up with young people that haven't learned some of the great lessons from the past by studying philosophy, by studying history. They don't understand the depths of evil. They don't understand that certain things are right and certain things are wrong. And they sort of have developed this sort of non-judgmentalism that says, you know, even though I would think that the Holocaust isn't something I would want to do, I can't really bring myself to say that that is evil, that is wrong. And so in some respects, Jordan Peterson says, if we head down this path, we're going to end up with, if you will, not only just the anarchy that's starting to develop right now, where everybody does what they think is right in their own eyes, to borrow a phrase from the Old Testament, but nobody can even make moral judgments anymore. And that seems to be one of the things that surfaces time and time again in some of his presentations and his debates.
Oh, exactly. This is why he has also probed, as you mentioned, that there is a naive sentimentalism ethically that dominates, that ignores evil, ignores the reasons for suffering and tragedy. And drawing from Jung, he'll use the word shadow within, that people often deny or negate. Christianity would just be called sin, missing the mark of meaning in that sense. And he would, his argument is that if you ignore or deny these things, then people reach cul-de-sacs, and to say I don't have to worry about the past and I just move forward, well, what's the criteria for moving forward, to what? And if a person can't name what they're moving towards in the classical sense of a telos, then they wander all over, and the implications are there for many. And this is why for him, we're in a culture of chaos. This is why even in his exegesis of Genesis, his underlying concern is more existential and psychological than, the origins and timeline of the earth. It's that there is this tension in the human journey between order and chaos. If you push order too far one direction, you get totalitarianism. Sometimes chaos is necessary to undermine that. But what's the difference between the counterfeit of order and genuine order that myth gives us? But we live in a culture in which order is seen as the problem. It's deconstructed. It inhibits my freedom. Hence, then we have liberty, but liberty and chaos. And he argues that when liberty leads to chaos, you essentially have a culture that is on a descent route, like a herd of lemmings. And his argument is that even 12 rules for life, again, it's an antidote to chaos. There is order. What's the myths in a perennial way that give meaning, not pseudo-order, but meaningful and eternal order of the soul and society. But he just sees chaos in terms of sheer fragmentation and what's the order that good stories bring, particularly myth. But when we've lost memory, this makes it very hard for young people, as you say, and I get many of them as my students, who are absolutely in a forest and they can't find the clearings, like Dante can't find his way, you know?
Yeah. Can't find a way. Yeah. Let me take a break, and then when we come back, let me take on that issue that you just mentioned a minute ago, because there's this idea of sort of enforced authoritarianism, and that's what really got him on that center stage, because he said, I'm not going to use these gender-neutral pronouns, and I'm not going to use these speech codes. And let's talk about some of those dangers, because that's something that's part of Jordan Peterson. We'll talk about that right after these messages.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Dr. Ron Dart with us for a few more minutes. And again, he is the editor and also one of the contributors to this book, Myth and Meaning, and Jordan Peterson. And if you would like to know a little bit more about the book, we have information about it on our website. It is published by Lexham Press, and I think you should be able to find it if you go to the website. Maybe find it in your bookstore, but we certainly made it very easy for you to get it in hardback or Kindle. And Ron Dart, for just a minute, let's say we talk about something that really kind of put Jordan Peterson on the map, and that is the so-called use, the mandatory use of non-binary gender-neutral pronouns. So you can't say his or her or him or hers or anything like that. You've got to say, I guess, Z or they. Actually, you have to use bad grammar. And in some respects, what he was reacting to is that given the fact that we're in the midst of chaos, you can't continue to have chaos. You can't have everybody do their own thing, because sooner or later somebody's thing's going to get into somebody else's thing. You can't swing your arms wildly, because your freedom to swing your arms widely ends at the tip of my nose. And so there's been this attempt with speech codes and really kind of almost an authoritarian structure in a lot of universities, maybe not yours, but in a lot of schools where I've had a chance to speak over the years, that require this. And that's where Dr. Jordan Peterson said, I am not going to do this. And in some respects, that's really what put him on the map in the first place.
Yes, very, very much so. A lot of Peterson's work over the years has been his fear of various forms of authoritarian or totalitarian ways of being public and political. So whether it's his work on Soviet Russia, his preface to one of Solzhenitsyn's works of fascism, Nazism, groupthink, what C.S. Lewis would call the inner ring. He has a real concern as a classical liberal of people who don't know how to be self-critical. They can always be other-critical. And this potential law that was coming down through a compelled speech from Ontario, underneath it he saw, obviously not as in tragic a way as big leftist and rightist authoritarian, totalitarian governments, another form of mindless group speech that enforces a way to think on a public. And he rebelled against that in a counterculture manner and said, first, turning this into law is highly problematic, but the ideology back of it is serious and has to be faced into. And many intellectuals and academics will write about it. Very few will enter the fray. It's like Milton in Areopagitica says, I cannot praise a cloistered virtue that never sallies forth. And many intellectuals, they have these, and even people in the culture wars, right and left, they will take their positions but never enter the fray in a way that Peterson has.
Yes. Right
into the trenches. And he's been, you get people who it's all hagiography from the right and demonization and cannon firing at him from the left. And it takes a lot of courage to take that level of abuse rhetorically from people. And, of course, he's paid the price for that, and it's been very, very difficult on him and his family. But underneath the question you're asking is his concern with group think, and it's sort of what Jesus would call the mote beam. It's easy to constantly critique the other but not see the beam in one's own eye. And he asks people, as he does of himself, as an honest intellectual, what may be not only the mote in my eye, but the beam. And ideologues tend to just tend to take the position that the other is the problem, but my position is defensible. It's absolutely right, and there are no chinks or problems in it whatsoever. And his concern is what happens when these ideas move into the realm of the university and then move into the courts and then get applied in people's lives. And so he goes right at the issue, right at the root level, at a philosophical level, because he knows if this isn't dealt with, and many people don't deal with it in the way he has, and he knows there's implications. And so he's gone into the lion's den in a way few have in the way he has done it, and he's paid the price for it. But I think many both admire him for it, and many turn on him viciously with their claws out also.
Yes, and it kind of connects up to an interview we did a while back with Jonathan Haidt, The Coddling of the American Mind, because in there he talks about all sorts of things, but one of those is the idea of tribalism, and the various untruths, and one of those is this idea that it's us versus them, and so this tribalism, this us versus them, is certainly something we've seen in the political realm, which I talk about almost every day, but we see it in the university as well. And so, if nothing else, I just appreciate the fact that he's been willing to speak out, but did, as you said, pay a price. But just before we wind down, Ron Dart, let's, if we can, talk about what can Christians take away from an individual, because some might say, well, he's not a Christian, so why should I read what he has to say? I'd rather go read C.S. Lewis or Tolkien. At least they're talking about myths that somehow relate to the Bible, or I'd like to go and read a non-fictional book. But are there some things that we can learn from somebody like Jordan Peterson, who's really kind of stood out there and pointed out that the academic emperor's clothes really aren't there in the first place.
Well, I would say the first thing would be the courage to enter the battlefield, face the bullets, graze off your skin and your soul, because many, can toss grenades across the fields into the larger culture, political, economic wars, but they themselves are not harmed or damaged too badly. Peterson, probably more than any other person, has entered that fray, and it takes great courage to do that rather than just, preach to your own choir. Secondly, he has played a very significant role, as I mentioned earlier, like a Virgil in some ways, in drawing a lot of people to Christianity. He himself lives in a tension, which I think a lot of younger people very much appreciate in terms of belief and doubt. So he's groping towards these great eternal truths, but he, like a doubting Thomas, has all sorts of doubts. And many young people, there's this longing to believe in something more. They don't want to be nihilists. They just don't want to fold their hands and give up. They want to believe in something, but they have all sorts of rational reasons for not, which they slip then into cynicism, skepticism, doubt. And for him, they're drawn to this doubt, but they're also drawn to his longing for the eternal and how myths can assist them in that journey. So in that sense, he's a proto-evangelist in a way that very many apologists certainly don't get the public attention Peterson does, is he points to Christianity, and many people have followed him on that journey. So if he can be seen as an interesting way, as an apologist that gets far more attention publicly regarding Christianity, and has paid the price for doing so, particularly from ideological secularists and postmodern liberalism. So much can be learned from Peterson. In one sense, his attempt to articulate a meaningful journey will certainly take him into the great eternal truths of which Christianity incarnates and embodies in Christ.
Sure. Well, I appreciate you, first of all, joining us for an hour. Appreciate you putting together this series of essays and writing one of those. And most importantly, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Well, thank you for giving me the time to say a few things.
Well, again, I get from time to time questions from Christians saying, what do you think about Jordan Peterson? So nothing else. We now have this particular interview and, of course, this book, which might help you get some thoughts about an individual that has certainly stirred the pot and really raised some very important questions in ways that I think we as Christians should raise them as well. This chaos is due in large part to abandoning some of these biblical ideas. And even though he's not a Christian, he points to a lot of things that we as Christians could agree with. But let's take a break. When we come back, okay, we are in the midst of a pandemic. How are we going to educate young people? We're going to talk about distance learning from ACSI. All that coming up right after this.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
For about half an hour now, we're going to talk about education, and in particular, you can see what has happened during this pandemic. Shelter in place, the lockdown has required individuals who maybe never before were engaged in distance learning, online learning, to do so. And so I wanted to let you know that there's some great resources through ACSI, which stands for the Association of Christian Schools International. They have what are called purposeful design publications, and that's just one of many resources that are available. But how to think about this in the future, because I am not so sure that when schools convene again in the fall, they're going to look exactly like they did before we had this lockdown. And so I thought it would be really helpful to try to get some perspective on that. And so that's why we wanted to turn to Dr. Larry Taylor. He's been on the program with us before, spent the last 2 decades as the head of school at Prestonwood Christian Academy, where more than 1,600 different students are enrolled in 4 different campuses. But he also more recently has accepted the role as the president of the Association of Christian Schools International. And, of course, we've talked about ACSI in the past, where they have more than 25,000 schools across the country. Matter of fact, across about 108 countries, I should say, actually, and about 5.5 million students worldwide that receive Christian education. Dr. Larry Taylor has his doctorate in philosophy of leadership studies from Dallas Baptist University, originally from Florida, where he had a bachelor's degree from the University of Central Florida, master's degree from Nova University. And Dr. Larry Taylor, always great to have on the program with us.
Thank you, Kerby. It's such an honor to be with you. Always just so impressed with what you're doing and the scope of subjects, and certainly this is dear to my heart, the one we're talking about today.
Well, and again, some people say I wear more than one hat, both as the president of Probe and also the host of Point of View. Of course, I also teach at Prestonwood, maybe that's 3, but you got 2 hats on right now for sure, and that is you've accepted that role as president of the Association of Christian Schools International. Tell us kind of what that looks like for you in the future.
Well, we're in full force. I am transitioning and remaining strategic advisor, president emeritus at Prestonwood Christian Academy, but really have shifted, 99% of my focus right now has been for president of ACSI. And so the transition's in full force. I've only been in it about the last 5 or 6 months at this level.
Well, let me just mention that on our website, we do have, if we link on your picture there, the link to Prestonwood Christian Academy, in case people want to know about that. But then as they scroll down, we have the one to ACSI. And if they click on there, they're going to see, first of all, the best practices for online learning. You also have some distance learning resources. And I think you would agree with me that whatever happens this fall, this is kind of a new venture, and anybody that before said only education is going to take place in the classroom, in my Christian school, in my church, I just don't see that happening, and I think this is going to be all the more reasonable to think about what we can now begin to do to learn about some of these really important issues. And I know you even have an individual speaking on some of those topics. So when people go to acsi.org, talk about some of those resources, because I wanted to alert people to finding some of those materials.
Certainly. I would highly recommend that our website. In fact, we have a special COVID-19 coronavirus landing page once you get on our website. And we already have, well over 10, 15 archive virtual town halls that address this. Not all on distance learning, but address just the magnitude of this paradigm shift. In fact, just minutes before joining you, we had some experts. We were hosting a town hall on specific best practices for online, and we had school leaders from Cuba, from Albania, from Nigeria, and of course from the United States. We had them from all over the globe. But if they go to the website, really, really solid resources, both in written form and in virtual town hall video archive, on how to address, you name it, and we're covering it, how to address this paradigm shift and preparing for the fall and the different scenarios that could continue.
Yes, what just ended a few minutes ago, as I mentioned, and you mentioned as well, best practices in online learning, and the speaker is Dr. David Mulder. So you again can go to ACSI, and if you find yourself saying, okay, I really want to learn this, or even if you're listening right now and you say, okay, I'm not in a Christian school, but I know my pastor would want to benefit from this, or I know somebody that is in the Christian school movement, and they are probably struggling right now, because one of the things I've heard, Larry, are some of your former teachers there at Prestonwood are saying, I thought teaching at Prestonwood Christian Academy was difficult, and then we had to do it by Zoom, and this is a lot more difficult than I thought it was going to be, if nothing else, to keep the attention of these kids. So this is just a whole new paradigm, a whole new frontier, and the reason I wanted to focus on this is for people to know there's some resources out there that you don't have to do it alone, and you don't have to reinvent the wheel, right?
Yeah, I really appreciate you saying that, because it is new, and there are some schools that had already, and Prestonwood's one of them, but there's several schools around the country and the globe that had already started diving into the online blended learning. But even like you said, even for those schools and the others, it's a new instructional strategy, so to speak. And so it's certainly a new delivery system. But the good thing is there are people that have been doing this and have developed best practices. You mentioned Dr. Mulder from Dordt College, who just hosted our virtual town hall. And so we have some rich resources. I would also add, I appreciate you saying, this is our resources are not just for Christian schools. They can be used by homeschool parents. They can be used by public school teachers. It's in fact, we even have one for parents. We hosted a virtual town hall last week just for parents, and so we're kind of cover the bases, and it definitely goes beyond. You don't have to be a member of ACSI or a school to get on our website, and we want to make that available for everybody, pastors, youth pastors, and all the above.
Let's take a break, and when we come back, let's talk about a few of those best practices. We are privileged to have with us a little bit longer Dr. Larry Taylor, who has for 20 years been the head of school at Prestonwood Christian Academy, now, of course, is the president of the Association of Christian Schools International. Works with about 25,000 schools, but as we'll talk about after the break, you don't even have to be a member of ACSI, but can I encourage you to do so, because I think they can really bring a lot to the table in terms of your own school. And over the years, I've been involved in one way or another sometimes where they've done some evaluation of those schools and just to provide some guidance and direction. We have a lot more to cover. We'll do that right after these important messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Should the rest of the country have to play by New York rules? Brett Stevens doesn't think so. He lives in New York City and writes for the New York Times, but he understands why most of America doesn't want to live under a national lockdown just because of how the virus pandemic has slammed New York. He begins by reminding us of the famous cover for The New Yorker with the title View of the World from 9th Avenue. Manhattan is in the foreground, there's a brownish strip called Jersey, and the rest of America is in the distance. He says that could almost be a map for the epidemic. When he wrote the column, there are more fatalities in Long Island's Nassau County with a population of 1.4 million than in all of California with a population of 40 million. There were more fatalities in Westchester County, 989, than in Texas, 611. Virus deaths per 100,000 in New York City were more than 16 times what could be found in America's next largest city, Los Angeles. Why so many infections and deaths in New York City? Well, it has the highest population density among U.S. cities of 100,000 or more. Commuters crowd trains, office workers crowd elevators, diners crowd restaurants. No other city has the same kind of jammed pedestrian life as New York. He understands why so much of the country is ready to open up and has dwindling sympathy for lockdown conditions that may still be necessary for New York City for the near future. He also acknowledges that his argument goes against his personal interest. He believes people in safe suburban neighborhoods should not be prevented from returning to their jobs just because he and others choose to live, travel, and work in what he calls urban sardine cans. That's why we should not have to play by New York rules. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Socialism, go to viewpoints.info/socialism. That's viewpoints.info/socialism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Dr. Larry Taylor with us for a few more minutes, president of the Association of Christian Schools International. And a couple of days ago, we talked about how Harvard University's latest magazine actually had an article which was blasting homeschool as dangerous because it said that parents are exercising authoritarian control over their kids. Well, that's homeschools, but now as we see many of these Christian schools also having online learning, I can see that not only will they be aiming their attacks on homeschooling, but maybe even on the Christian schools. And the argument is oftentimes made that what this does is these are individuals that want to isolate their kids from the ideas and values central to democracy. But the reality is, if you look at the reason why parents either homeschool or send their kids to Christian school, the number one reason is a concern about the school environment in terms of drugs or negative peer pressure. Number two, maybe the dissatisfaction with the academic program at the schools or the desire to provide religious instruction. So, Larry, in some respects right now, we're seeing that homeschools are starting to be attacked by some of the elites. But I think part of that has to do with the fact that they're recognizing that the entire country is now, in a sense, being educated at home. And I think some of the parents are saying, my kid's behavior is just a whole lot better when they're not around the negative influences of public schools. So while right now the focus is on homeschooling, I think Christian schools are going to come in for it as well. And that's another reason why I think some of these schools should join with you at ACSI, don't you think?
Absolutely. And, the old Harvard position that you just mentioned, and I don't want to get off on a tangent, but I think it's interesting. It definitely links to a more umbrella and universal opinion on, as you've attached, to the Christian school movement, or really anything that's a non-public delivery. I do think it's kind of interesting that the research overwhelmingly supports the opposite of what the Harvard Journal reported. They reported an opinion, not what the research provides. And Christian schools, I think we are used to that same scrutiny and used to the same criticism. And again, I would just say our position is we're not anti-public school or anti any type of school. We're pro-education and we're pro-parent choice, and we just believe that parents know their kids better than anyone else does. And the objective data, the research that's coming out of highly credible research entities such as Cardis, the Cardis Research Group, think tank that partners with Notre Dame. Their research on truly objective data demonstrates the benefit of private Christian education, and not just in the Christian worldview development, although that is the main distinctive, but the contribution that Christian schools have to the public good, several categories. And so, we're used to it. We think it's going to increase. It's also kind of ironic that Harvard has been promoting their online programs. I think I get 2 or 3 of those a day. So I think they need to really be careful about speaking out of both sides of the mouth.
Yes, and I was just thinking about this because I do know enough about your graduates at Prestonwood Christian Academy that have gone to a lot of the elite schools. Kids that sometimes have been homeschooled have gone to these elite schools. So this idea that somehow they're getting a substandard education if they're in the Christian environment actually is so wrong. And it, I think, brings us back to the fact that given the fact that this fall it's going to be a lot different, what could that maybe look like? You've been now hearing some of these people talking about best practices. Is it possible we may end up with a mixture where some days the kids are in class and other days they're doing online education? And will the online education be as good as what they receive in the classroom? What do you think?
Well, the answer is yes. I think we're going to see a dramatic increase. Especially in the fall, I think we're going to see a dramatic increase in blended learning where some of the education takes place on campus, some of it takes place at home or in some other type of learning center. And the good thing about that is, and I'm not recalling the actual research article at this point, I can give it to you later, but the latest research on advanced placement testing scores, the online, and this is coming from a public school district in Texas somewhere, the online delivery of advanced placement testing the scoring was actually higher than the traditional face-to-face. So,
that makes sense.
And so I think we're going to see a blend. I think some of the delivery systems, I call them a hybrid university model type school. I think we're going to see an increase from the COVID-19 impact, but even beyond that, I think we're going to see the paradigm shift that was already taking place. Personalized education options, whether that's 100% online or, a combination of on-campus, off-campus. I think we're going to see that continue to grow. It's going to accelerate.
One of the advantages of online education is a little bit like what you get with homeschooling, because we oftentimes say that homeschooling, you can have delight-directed education. You got a young person, they just really into math, and they just shooting on ahead, and you can just kind of let them go a lot faster. When you're in a group, obviously you have to kind of keep all of the group moving at the same pace. And it seems to me that with online education, there are ways that you could allow an individual that gets the concept real quickly and moves ahead. And so in some respects, I can see how you might actually do better with some of this blended education. With the online education, allows some of the kids to pursue that. And again, if they want to get advanced placement, I know I did that when I was a kid. And of course, now all the kids are doing that. That is a lot less expensive for mom and dad when all of a sudden you've been able to receive all sorts of course credits at the university before you even arrive. So it seems to me that this is really good. But just before we go, let's talk about again what people can find when they go to ACSI, that stands for Association of Christian Schools International.org. You've got all these coronavirus resources. I also have this material from Purposeful Design Publications on math resources and science instruction and science lesson plans and samplers and resources. So talk about some of the resources, which again, as you pointed out, is available not only to people that are members of ACSI, but even if you're a Sunday school teacher, even if you're a homeschool teacher, a parent, whatever, those are resources. So talk about what is available as people land on your website.
No, absolutely. Our position again, Kerby, has been, you don't have to be a member. We want to invite the world to the website. In fact, something I failed to mention earlier, we have an online professional development program that has about 500 to 600 hours of training for teachers and leaders, and we've been offering that for free. For 2 months, we've had over 3,000 people sign up for that. And so that's another resource I would highly recommend. Take advantage of the free subscription for that. But just a plethora, whether it's legal and legislative related, whether it's instructional strategies, really it's all the above. And like I said, we have the not just current archived virtual town halls on the myriad of subjects, but we have a host of town halls coming up in the next couple of weeks and couple of months, including best practices to think about when reopening and the different scenarios that could happen. So from the professional development to the town halls to the purposeful design, it's really all the above. Yes. Tremendous base of resources that cover the globe. One last comment I would make is, we because we're a global team, we have countries, Korea and some other countries, that are a month ahead of us, and so we're able to study some of what they're doing.
Very good, yeah.
And that helps us here in the States develop not just theory, but we're studying some countries that are ahead of us.
Very good. Dr. Larry Taylor, great to have you on the program. When we get him out of lockdown, I want to see you face-to-face, but if nothing else, thank you for joining us today. We will take a break, and again, one more time, go to acsi.org. When we come back, we're going to talk about this National Day of Prayer tomorrow. All that coming up right after this.
(2020). Is there anything important happening this year? Oh, not unless you consider major disputes in various Christian denominations, international tensions over a flu epidemic, economic uncertainties, and a presidential election important. Question: where will you get real news, credible opinion, clear biblical thinking on the things that matter most? Answer: Point of View Radio with Kerby Anderson and the team. You can make sure their voices continue speaking loud and clear by taking a moment right now and joining the Truth Team. It's easy, but you do have to visit our website or make a quick call. Go to pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. You have the power to make a difference. Joining the Truth Team can help ensure that millions of people will get a different opinion from the major purveyors of fake news. We don't get big advertising dollars like the networks or tax money like PBS. We depend on you. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour. If you'd like to join our conversation, that number is 1-800-351-1212. 1-800-351-1212. Let me just real quickly mention that about an hour or so, I sent out an email talking about Pray for America. And this is something that we have been trying to develop so that you can really be praying for America, especially since we have, of course, the National Day of Prayer taking place tomorrow. If you did not receive receive that email, you might want to go to the website, pointofview.net. There's a button on the right-hand side that says Pray for America, subscribe. And it's just real simple. We just need your name and email so we can send out from time to time some of the information. And tomorrow is a very significant day because since 1952, we've actually had a formal National Day of Prayer. 1988, it was actually formalized to be the first Thursday in May, which will be tomorrow, May 7th. And so this has always been a time in which we've been able to participate. Matter of fact, lots of times I like to get some comments from some of you that have been to one of the 60,000 different local community events to pray. Matter of fact, I was an MC at one last year in this area, but that is not probably going to be happening. So let me point you to some virtual events, one of which I've been talking about for people that used to exist just in the Dallas area. But if you have access to a computer, for example, you can go on Facebook and find the hopecenter.org, or either that website or just go to the Hope Center Facebook page. And at noon Central Time, which of course would be 1 o'clock Eastern, to be 10 o'clock Pacific, or wherever you happen to be in the country, that is an event that is going to have kind of a who's who of people that we've interviewed on this program, including Colonel Alan West, who will be one of the many speakers. So that is something that is happening kind of at the noontime hour, and you may have some others that your church are doing, and you can certainly go on the websites and find that. But let me just mention that tomorrow night is an event that is a national event, and it will probably be on your television screen. I think TBN and some others are carrying it, but let's see, Daystar's carrying it. Let's see, God TV is carrying it. I know it's on radio. The Bot Radio Network, Moody Radio Network is carrying it as well. But you can also, of course, get it on Facebook and a number of other things. And it's being hosted by the Presidential Prayer Team. It will be taking place at 8 p.m. Eastern, which would be 7 Central, all the way down to 5 Pacific, so that it gives you a little bit of a feel for where that might be. Since, again, we broadcast in more than 40 different states, you'll kind of have to figure out where that would work out for you. But it is going to be hosted by Will Graham, who is the evangelist with the Billy Graham organization, the grandson of the late Billy Graham. And, it says just a who's who of all sorts of people that will be speaking and praying there. Nick Hall, Harry Jackson, Luis Palau, Rick Warren, Billy Wilson. I think I noticed that Eric Metaxas is there, Jack Graham. I mean, you go down the list of all sorts of people that you will want to hear from. And so I just think it's going to be an opportunity to pray God's glory across the earth, which is based upon Habakkuk 2, verse 14. And so, again, this has been something that has existed really since 1952. But as I've pointed out before, we've had about 130 different presidential prayer proclamations, starting with George Washington all the way to now Donald Trump. And so I encourage you to pray for this country. I encourage you to find out more. And if you want to find out more about these two events, the hopecenter.org is the one that's kind of in the noon hour, and then the National Day of Prayer.org for the one tomorrow night. And we'll try to give you a little more information about that, but since one of those will be taking place while we're doing the show, I just wanted you to know about it ahead of time and encourage you to participate if you can. Let's go to some of the articles I've posted here today. And the first one I kind of jokingly entitled, Where's the Beef? And the reason for that is Wendy's is running out of hamburger meat. You might go, how is that happening? Well, Brad Palumbo put it this way. First, we ran out of toilet paper. Now we're running out of hamburgers, he says. And it has to do with the meat supply chain due to the fact that some of these meat packing plants are shutting down, and some of them have had some problems with various regulatory factors. President Trump has been trying to address the problem by classifying meat packing plants as essential, pushing to try to keep them open. But there are some real important issues there, and so that article you can read in its entirety, but I thought I'd also quote from another one by Michael Brendan Doherty, which is entitled, Where's the Beef?, in which he points out that these meat processing plants have been hit hard by the coronavirus disease, COVID-19, and some of that has to do with the fact that many of the people working there maybe are not familiar with English. maybe did not understand some of the precautions, but also just the elbow-to-elbow nature of their work has made them much more vulnerable. And what this might mean is even having some political issues here as well, because this might be, as they point out, the first time since the 1970s, when we had the oil crisis, that Americans on a mass scale may be exposed to rationing, to shortages, to long lines and things of that nature. So we'll see where that goes, but if nothing else, you can understand that if people go into their supermarket and see empty meat counters, there may be a tendency to simply say, well, I'll just blame the president, and we will just not reelect him. And so that is the case. And you might say, well, can't we just cover that with things happening in other countries? And I did not know this until I read this recently, that if you want to look at the world meat trade, U.S. and Brazil and Canada account for 2/3 of it, 65%. So that's because, first of all, we have lots of land, we have cattle pastures and all the rest. So many people might blame the shortage on Donald Trump. It isn't necessarily his fault, but the reality is that is certainly an issue. And when you look at shortages, that certainly did not bode well for Gerald Ford, did not bode that well for Jimmy Carter during the 1970s. And so if we end up with these kind of shortages, that's going to be a real issue. And the impact that it's had even on the food banks, where there are more and more people going to get food assistance at a time when there have been about a 30% decrease in food donations. We're in this ironic situation in which we have a surplus of food, but getting the food to the market is difficult. And then even when you move from meat to potatoes, the National Potato Council says that there's about $1.3 billion worth of potatoes and potato products, but they can't sell them. They're trying to figure out a way to donate them, because these were potatoes that would have been potatoes or French fries given to restaurants which aren't open or to schools that are not open. So you can see how some of this is played out. So let's take some phone calls along the way. If you'd like to join us, that number is 1-800-351-1212. We've been talking about the National Day of Prayer. I'm talking about food shortages, and we'll get into a couple of issues in just a minute. Let's head up to Maine. Veronica, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Oh, I'm delighted to be able to talk with you and tell you about this.
Tell us what's going on up there in Maine.
Well, I was astonished today when I called the Maine State Rep for National Day of Prayer and said, hey, I just wanted to find out, is there something going on in my town, and how do I link up with whatever they're doing? And she started to tell me about how they had things organized at the state capitol. They were planning on going there, and the state pulled the permit. So they are not allowed.
Wow.
And I said, does the governor have a copy of the Constitution? I think that falls under our First Amendment rights. And she said, I hear you. I hear what you're saying. And she said, but we were told as a state chapter that we need to do individually what our states are requiring. And I said, does National Day of Prayer have a copy of the Constitution? And she said, I don't know. I said, maybe I need to mail both of them a copy of the Constitution. So it's pretty shocking that the National Day of Prayer would be canceled by, we've been calling her the governess of Maine.
And boy, we have talked about her a little bit, and Tucker Carlson talked about her the other day. So, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, it's a very interesting situation how she came to be elected. The outgoing Governor LePage, when he signed the paperwork, he wrote stolen election, and that wasn't just sour grapes. He was at the end of his term limit, so he wasn't trying to be reelected. And she was elected with more votes than there are registered voters in Maine.
I know. I've heard some of the stories. Well, I do need to take a break, but I'm glad you brought this up. Let me see what else I can find out. Maybe we can cover some of that tomorrow. And if you have any articles you want to send to us, or a footnote or something like that, we'll certainly cover that, because I do want to try to give a little bit of coverage tomorrow to the National Day of Prayer and learn some of these lessons. And I'm unfortunately afraid that this is not going to be the only state which is going to say, well, because of the pandemic, we can't even have you meeting together, even if you're socially distancing. So, Veronica, thank you for reminding us that that's happening up there in the great state of Maine.
Thanks for letting me tell you.
Let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll take another phone call or two. And that's the first of, I'm sure, many that we're going to be hearing about. And so, if nothing else, that's all the more reason for you to participate in some of these virtual prayer meetings through the National Day of Prayer. So we'll come back and talk with some more of you right after these important messages.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Let me just mention a few of the other articles we have on the website. And one of those that I did not post, but maybe we can post tomorrow in case you're interested, by Dominic Green, which says, "Lockdown is over, someone tell the government." And I love this because his argument is that the shutdown is really happening and has happened from many of the government leaders. But now the shutdown is over because of public demand. He said there are crowds of sunbathers in the parks of New York City, mobs on the steps of the state houses, pedestrian and road traffic is rising. Businesses are defying orders by informally reopening. And part of that is simply because you have a number of individuals simultaneously doing this. Here in the Dallas area, just not far from where we're broadcasting, there is a woman by the name of Shelley Luther who was actually cited yesterday by a judge for opening her hair salon early. And so as a result, she has to spend 7 days in jail. Actually, it was a 14-day sentence, but 2 of those are happening concurrently. So 7 days in jail, $7,000 in fines. And I've always said that if she really had wanted to change everybody's attitude, because it looks like she has changed the attitude now, the governor of the state of Texas, she should have got other hair salon groups to gather with her rather than being the one individual easily singled out and then treated as an example. Now you have, if you have more and more people, you know, if you have a couple of stores open, well, maybe you can prosecute them. If you have 24 stores, that's a little more difficult. If you have 100 stores, there's just no way. And so that's the argument Dominic Green is making, that a lot of these people now, simply because there's enough of those people, there's just no way that the police are going to be able to arrest everybody that's a sunbather out there on Central Park. There's no way they're going to be able to race down everybody that's surfing in Southern California. And so they said these people are not all the people. They're not the doctors who counsel caution. They're not the state governors who are terrified of votes being washed away in a post-reopening second wave of casualties. But in a sense, what they're doing is calling the elected leaders bluff. And in some respects, we're seeing kind of civil disobedience at an uncontainable scale. And so whether they are right or wrong, and I'm not necessarily saying that everything that they're doing is right, it's happening simply because people have had enough. And so in some respects, the virus, of course, is still going to spread. We know that it's going to. We knew that lockdown wasn't going to prevent the spread of the virus. It would only reduce the spread speed, but we recognize that the goal of the flattening the curve was to prevent an overloading of the hospitals. But nevertheless, that is going to be taking place now as more and more people are, if they're disobeying the lockdown, are out there anyway, or if the governors have decided, if that's what people want, I'm going to give them what they have been asking for. So we are seeing more and more of that unfolding. A couple other articles I've posted, one on the pandemic political shift, which maybe we'll get into a little bit more tomorrow, because there are some that are suggesting because of this, there's going to be a shift more to conservative values. If for no other reason, we're going to have a lot more people in the state legislatures and even in Congress have to say, we just don't have enough money. We just can't simply continue to do this. And we can't raise taxes anymore because so many people are out of work in the first place. So that is one of those articles. But I wanted to point out two others real quickly. One by Julie Kelly called The Failed Experiment of Social Distancing. And in the article, she says, an experiment, what? But she says, we've been assured by the credentialed class that keeping a distance of 6 feet between healthy people for weeks on end was the only tried and true way to prevent the deadly spread of the coronavirus. As I pointed out before, that wasn't what it was described as. It was really to try to slow the rapidity, the speed at which it would spread. But she points out something on the third page, which I hadn't really thought about. That if you go on the website of the Centers for Disease Control, where they talk about social distancing, there are no links to any peer-reviewed social distancing studies. Both the CDC and the World Health Organization actually even confess a little bit of uncertainty as to whether or not there would be a long-term success to it. So then in the fourth page, if you want to go and read all the way through it, she points out that a number of years ago, back in 2006, there were a group of doctors and medical researchers, primarily at the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center, that at the time really kind of doubted how effective school closures, travel restrictions, and other things would be helpful, and how individual social distancing would be very helpful in terms of containing flu-like viruses. And one of the quotes from that article was, quote, "It has been recommended that individuals maintain a distance of 3 feet." Notice how that's changed. Back then, they were talking about 3 feet. Now we're talking about 6 feet. But again, it has been recommended that individuals maintain a distance of 3 feet or more during a pandemic so as to diminish the number of contacts with people who may be affected. But the efficacy of this measure is unknown. And so that was kind of the stand 14 years ago. But now two of the authors, and the author of this article, Julie Kelly, suggests because Donald Trump is now the president, have actually now advocated staying 6 feet apart. But their earlier article was wondering whether staying 3 feet apart or even social distancing was that effective. Now, again, you could say maybe over the last 14 years we've learned more, but it has been kind of interesting that it's a little bit more difficult to find any kind of peer review studies documenting some of that. Which leads me to my last piece by Dennis Prager, who also has been very critical of this lockdown and points out that this may be a mistake when we look back on it. And he points out that in some respects this mistake has not necessarily worked out so well in this country, but it is absolutely devastating around the world. The United Nations World Food Program states that by the end of the year, more than 260 million people will face starvation. The director of the World Food Program says we are looking at famine in about 36 countries. There is also a real danger that more people could potentially die from the economic impact of COVID-19 than from the virus itself. And then he also points out that if indeed, looking at some of the material from the International Food Policy Research Institute, if the global GDP declines by about 5%, which frankly seems likely, another 147 million people could be plunged into extreme poverty. And remember how many times on this program we've talked about the fact that because of the free market, because of capitalism, extreme poverty is beginning to fade, and we might eventually move everybody out of extreme poverty. Now the direction is going the other way. And so this is why some have posted in this particular article, he quotes from in The Nation, the lockdown is possibly could be even more catastrophic than the virus in its outcome, the collapse of the global food supply systems and widespread human starvation. And he points out that some are just saying, hey, this is just a mere inconvenience. Well, maybe for Americans that have money, but it's not an inconvenience for all the people lining up at these food banks, and it's certainly not an inconvenience, just an inconvenience for poverty around the world. So Michael Levitt, we'll end with this. Professor of structural biology at Stanford Medical School said, there is no doubt in my mind that when we come to look back on this, the damage done by the lockdown will exceed any saving of lives by a huge factor. This comes from a man that won the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 2013. So that's another article we're going to put on the table, and all the more reason to be in prayer for this nation. So let me encourage you to go to the website to find out some of these articles we've mentioned, and also to sign up to Pray for America. If there's ever been a time we need to pray for America, it is now. I want to thank Andrew for his help as an engineer, or Steve as his help as our producer. Have a great day. We'll see you back here tomorrow, right here on Point of View.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.